My name is Chris Famous. Forms of privatization, mutualization, outsourcing, all of which are, in my opinion, politically correct terms of saying cutting government jobs.
Those assets belong to the public. It will not produce jobs. It will not produce economic stability.
True equality, not just feel-good equality.
Be obscene and unconscionable to us to live in a place where it seems to be acceptable for some people to have too much wealth and for other people to have hardly any wealth at all.
My name is Chris Famous, and I'm here today with Reverend Nicholas Genevieve-Tweed, a mighty voice in Bermuda. As some would say, John the Baptist coming out of the wilderness to bring us a message that we sorely need. I want to say personally, thank you for coming to Bermuda, Reverend, coming back home, Reverend Tweed, and more importantly, thank you for bringing the message that you brought. Before further ado, I just want to ask you to speak for yourself.
Thank you, Brother Chris. It's a pleasure being here. I want to also commend you for your work and the voice that you bring, not only through your column, but through your involvement in the community and with the POP and the other entities that you engage with, because it is a critical voice and it is much needed, especially in the environment and in the climate in which we function.
In the time that we have now.
Yes.
Well, I think they have a saying in the church, teach a child the way, and when he gets older, he shall not depart from it. Now, I may, like many others, may have departed from the physical church, but many of us still keep the spiritual church within us, where we know we have to do the works of our Father, do the works to do unto others as we have them do unto the least of us. And one of the messages that is consistently coming from yourself and the church, St. Paul's, is a message of social justice, a message of equality, true equality, not just feel-good equality. And in a time now that we are in a recession, or some would say even depression, the word equality seems to be elusive to some, or they don't know what equality is. So these are the sort of things that I think Bermuda would like you to expand on.
Well, I think, unfortunately, and it's not just in Bermuda, but in the United States and Britain and other countries, equality has come to mean an abstract formulation that only refers to equal potential, but in actuality, inequality prevails, because the conditions that would give rise to everybody having equal opportunity do not exist. And so whenever you have a system in which the top 1% or 2% control 90% of the wealth, then it almost becomes absurd to talk about equality without also having a conversation about the equal distribution of wealth.
Well, for some, when they hear the terms equal distribution of wealth, they immediately see visions of socialism, this sort of like communist state where you just take from the rich and just spread it amongst the poor, and then society collapse. So what do you mean by, if you could give further examples of equal distribution of wealth?
Well, first of all, what I mean is, and let me clarify the foundation, first of all, because having read Marx's Das Kapital, all 3 volumes, having read other Marxist social thinkers, having read Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx was over 1,000 years too late, because the Apostle Paul was among the first people to expound the notion from each according to their ability to each according to their need. This is why in the early church, and it is attested to in Scripture, in the book of Acts, where Paul establishes a Christian community, one of the first things that they did was require that people sell all their possessions, turn their wealth over. One of the first things that they did was require that people sell all their possessions, turn their wealth over to the community. Then the community would redistribute according to need. And I'm not suggesting that we adopt that paradigm wholesale, but what I am saying is that equality means that in part it should be obscene and unconscionable to us to live in a place where it seems to be acceptable for some people to have too much wealth and for other people to have hardly any wealth at all. Where some people can't afford food on their table, where people that have government jobs have to moonlight at night doing 2 or 3 extra jobs to make ends meet. And yet you have corporate executives that have so much money that if they want a tax write-off, they buy a yacht or an expensive car or an expensive home. And so equal distribution means that in a society there ought to be some level of commitment to establishing parity, right? Does not mean everybody has the same thing, as in the stereotype of a socialist entity. And historically, for those persons that get into this argument about communism, even if one examines Russia from the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, what happened in Russia was the transition to a communist political system, but it was still a Tsarist, elitist economic system. So that if you were a member of the Politburo or part of the political elite in Russia, you still profited just as the old Tsarist aristocracy profited. And so Russia wouldn't be a good model either.
Okay. So, all right. You touched on a point that is very relevant to thousands in Bermuda. Currently, we have a government that is attempting to implement forms of privatization, mutualization, outsourcing, all of which are, in my opinion, politically correct terms of saying cutting government jobs. What is your opinion on these proposals that are put forward?
You know, having lived through the Thatcher era in Britain, and having lived through the tail end of the Reagan and Bush eras in the United States and the Clinton era, there is no model where privatization of public assets has actually produced the kind of transformation that the government or the former government claimed that it would. And part of our conversation really has to be honest enough to say that it really isn't about OBA or PLP, because many of the proposals to privatize or outsource or create quangos were actually on paper when the PLP were in power. It just so happens that in wake of the Sage Commission report and other things that have happened, it now has become convenient for the government to try to use the recession as a veil to advance an agenda of privatization. And I think what is clear for me, it is a violation of public trust for any government who has been entrusted by the people to represent the interests of the people to privatize or divest itself of public assets. The public, those assets belong to the public. The government manages or exercises stewardship over those assets on behalf of the people. Unless the people give the government a mandate to divest of public assets, then for me, it is a violation of public trust for the government to go down that path. It will not produce jobs. It will not produce economic stability, because during the economic recession, was precipitated by actions in the private sector.
Yeah, Burn, Wall Street, Lehman Brothers.
Right.
Too big to fail.
The housing bubble and all these things
Fannie Mae.
were precipitated by people in the private sector. So the private sector does not have a good track record in terms of managing assets. So I don't understand for the life of me why all of a sudden it becomes attractive to further privatize when the private sector doesn't have a good track record of managing assets, and certainly doesn't have a good track record when it comes to corporate or social responsibility.
Yeah, that leads to another topic. During the recent PLP budget reply, Shadow Finance Minister David Burke made mention of some sort of re-examining our tax structures. What is your take on the tax structure that you see presently in Bermuda?
I think that currently the tax structure in Bermuda perpetuates inequality. So that you have large, or not so large, but a minority of people who have what I would call unearned wealth. That wealth appears to be completely protected from any form of taxation. Then you have corporate tax breaks, and the idea then is that in order to attract and keep big business, Bermuda has to have as little tax responsibilities as possible. Otherwise, who would come to Bermuda and do business? And I think it's not an either or, it should be both and. There ought to be some medium where if a business makes profit in a place, that they ought to have some level of responsibility or care about the quality and standard of livings in the place that they do business. There ought to be some obligation in terms of maintaining employment levels among the indigenous people in which they make their money. So that, in other words, there should be some checks and balances. And nobody is suggesting that people should come here and not make any profit. I'm certainly not advocating that on the government's behalf, because I recognize the global system in which we live. It is driven by profit, and on behalf of their shareholders, they're obligated to generate as much return on their investment as possible. But it should not be at the expense of the quality of life for other human beings.
Okay.